Okay, next topic is US expansion during the first third of the 19th century. And this becomes relevant to Latin America because the majority of US expansion happens at the expense of Native Americans, Spanish America, and Mexican America. So here you get a sense of all the territories that were claimed by Spain at the beginning of the 19th century. The US expands with the Louisiana Purchase. Typically, when we learn about the Louisiana Purchase in US history, we learn things like the United States bought the Louisiana Territory from France in 1803. Then the Lewis and Clark expedition happens to map out this area, and then they encounter Sacagawea that helps them with these travels. What we don't learn is that France had just taken over the Louisiana Purchase just a year prior. Before that, it was part of Spain. And the Louisiana Purchase wasn't just some more land the US bought, it doubled the size of the United States. So that is quite significant. And when Lewis and Clark set out to map out this new territory, they did not limit themselves to the Louisiana territory. They went all the way to the Pacific Ocean, demonstrating the US's interest in wanting to expand from the very beginning of the century all the way to the Pacific Ocean. There's the War of 1812. Typically in US history, when we're taught about the War of 1812, we say, this happened, this was a war against England where we taught them, we were going to remain independent, they were going to take us back. It's a war that happened because the British Navy was arresting, they called it impressment, where they would arrest US sailors and make them work for them on their Navy ships. And so that is the reason the public was given, we're like, we have indignation. And so then, we're going to teach them that, they're not going to take us back. They're not going to push us around. That's kind of the way the story is typically told. And that's what people were told why the fighting happened. What we're typically not taught is that the War of 1812 was a war in which the United States wanted to expand west into Native American territory, especially what was the Southwest back then, the modern day South. And it was also the US wanting to expand into British Canada. And that's why most of the fighting didn't happen on the Atlantic coast where sailors were being impressed. Most of the fighting happened out west in the Great Lakes area. That's why the United States attacked, what was it? I think it was Ontario was their capital. And so we attacked their capital. And then in the South, a lot of the fighting was against Native Americans, and because we wanted to expand on their land in the South. And because of our attack of their capital of Ontario in 1814, the British burned down Washington, D.C. And so there, I just find it ironic that, I hope to get to lecture on the Texas-Mexican War, which is where we get the Battle of the Alamo and the expression, remember the Alamo. And so I just find it ironic that we remember the Alamo, but we don't remember the burning down of Washington, D.C. Because of our involvement, or because of what we did in the War of 1812. All right, in 1819, in Florida, the United States acquires Florida as part of the Adams-Onis Treaty. And typically with that, we're told in US history, this was an agreement between Spain and the United States, where Spain agreed to give us Florida. And we might have given them maybe $15 million. I'm not sure on the amount. What we don't learn in that story is about filibusters. And I've already talked about filibusters before when I talked about Nicaragua and William Walker. But just a reminder, filibustering happened throughout the 19th century, especially in the early 19th century. And it happened a lot in Florida. It happened in Florida in 1810, 1813, 1814. And so this is when US citizens would arm themselves, go into Spanish Florida, and take over an island, take over a port, take over a region. And they would say, we bring you freedom and independence, and we're going to be in charge. And then eventually the US would annex that territory. And so when the United States and Spain signed the Adams-Onis Treaty, also known as the Transcontinental Treaty, the US had already militarily taken over Florida. And so some historians refer to it as more similar to a street corner holdup than a negotiation. I also touched on this in the lectures on independence, because at this point, at this point in 1819, Spain was on the verge of losing Mexico. And there were other parts of Latin America that were fighting for their independence. So when Spain handed Florida over to the United States, there was also part of the agreement was also that the United States was not going to help Mexico or other Latin American countries get their independence. And so, yeah, just a little bit more background there. The Monroe Doctrine, something we've touched on as well, where in 1823, James Monroe says to the world, especially Europe, we're not gonna, you're no longer going to be colonizing parts of Latin America. Now, what is not said in that statement is that because we're claiming it for ourselves, and not to mention that European countries continued at least a half dozen times to colonize parts of the Americas anyways. We didn't have the Navy to be able to enforce it anyways. In the 1830s, we have the forceful removal of Native Americans. And so we're most familiar with the Trail of Tears. Aspects of this we're less familiar with is that these tribes were sometimes referred to as the civilized tribes. And that was because these tribes had been in contact with the Spanish since the 16th century. And so they had a long history of interaction with Europeans. And some of these tribes, like the Cherokee, went to great lengths to try to assimilate to US culture so that they wouldn't be forcibly removed. They drafted a constitution, they had separation of powers, they wrote down their language, they tried to assimilate to US culture a lot. To the point, being in the South, there were even Cherokees that owned slaves as trying to fit into the US South. But nothing they did spared them from being forcibly removed to these new Native American reservations, where they were told that if they moved there, they would be able to keep that land forever and ever and weren't going to be bothered. And we didn't keep those promises either. So now we start looking at Texas. And I'm actually going to separate this. Oh, do I? Well, yeah, just a little bit.